1941, German troops crossed the border into the Soviet Union's portion of occupied Poland. Many of the Soviet troops did not understand what was happening, such as in the fortress of Brest. The fortress was seen as a major strategic advantage, making a prime target for the Wehrmacht. Once the invasion had begun, the German army had begun the attack commenced by the Luftwaffe, which began bombarding the fortress alongside artillery, which lasted for a grand total of 29 minutes. The fortress was occupied by both servicemen and their families, meaning that civilians were also caught within the battle. While the bombardment itself lasted only 29 minutes, it led to mass disarray within the Soviet Union. As it was early in the morning, Soviet troops were caught completely off guard and scrambled to get to their positions, unaware of what was happening. Some thought it was trainings, even though it was obviously not training. While the army command scrambled to gather together what was happening, their troops ran around panicking while the artillery struck. This would soon be followed as the Wehrmacht began to cross the Bug River in order to stage an infantry assault upon the fortress. The rapid advance of the Wehrmacht did not allow the Soviets to mount a static defense against the Wehrmacht, and instead held out in pockets, particularly within the fortress itself. The Germans seized vital positions such as the field hospital, which they began to purge to make room for any injured German soldiers. Many of the civilians who were trapped inside the fortress made a desperate attempt to escape. However, the German army had ended up surrounding the fortress, cutting off all routes of escape. Many civilians and soldiers attempted an escape and only ended up finding themselves running straight into German machine gun emplacements placed in particular points where it would be easiest for civilians to exit in order to mow them down. This is a part of Hitler's final solution, which showed no remorse towards any of the Slavic citizens, in which a complete and total extermination was eventually planned. Fighting within the pockets continued on for several more days, one of which was led by Pyotr Gavrilov, who ended up leading successful Soviet sallies out of the fortress against the Germans. He would eventually go on to earn the Hero of the Soviet Union medal, even though he would be captured by the Germans at the end of the siege. His attacks helped to demoralize the Germans and buy the men inside the fortress more time. Much of the fighting during the battle would come down to brutal hand-to-hand combat, as the Soviets began to run low on ammunition and supplies, along with a mentality of death or victory. While not to the extent of the Japanese later on in the war, they would die in the name of their country. Although not all men, and some would retreat or be captured, many men would choose to charge the Germans in what would be known as a Soviet Ura charge, in which the Soviets would equip their bayonets and begin a almost suicidal charge against the Germans, planning to cause as much damage as possible. This would set the tone for much of the rest of the war in the Eastern Front, as the Soviets would fight for every scrap of land they could, trying not to give themselves up to the German invader or their rapacious violence against the Soviet people. Some Soviet troops were able to link up and coordinate their actions under the command of Captain Ivan Zubachov. His second in command was Regimental Commissar Yefim Fomin. On the 26th of June, small Soviet forces tried to break out from the siege, but sustained heavy losses and casualties, and were unsuccessful. Unfortunately, the attempt, as was said, was not successful and resulted in the deaths of many of the Soviets' remaining troops to survive. This greatly lowered the time it would take for the Germans to take and seize the fortress, and would soon lead to the defeat of the Soviets. Total German losses in the battle for Brest Fortress were about 429 killed and 668 wounded. The Soviet losses numbered about 6,800 prisoners of war and 2,000 dead. The magnitude of these losses can be weighed by the fact that the total German losses on the Eastern Front up to 30th of June 1941 amounted to 8,886 killed. The fighting at Brest therefore accounted for over 5% of all German fatalities.
Полковой комиссар Фомин Ефим Моисеевич был расстрелян у Холмских ворот в конце июня 1941 года. В 1957 награжден орденом Ленина. Посмертно. Майор Гаврилов Петр Михайлович был взят в плен тяжело раненым на 32-й день войны. Как и многие, побывавшие в плену, был подвергнут репрессиям, исключен из партии. И только в 1957 году ему было присвоено звание Героя Советского Союза. В 1965 году начальнику 9-й погранзаставы лейтенанту Кижеватову Андрею Митрофановичу было присвоено звание Героя Советского Союза. Посмертно.
By late October, the German forces were worn out, with only a third of their motor vehicles still functioning, infantry divisions at third to half strength, and serious logistic issues preventing the delivery of warm clothing and other winter equipment to the front. Even Hitler had seemed to surrender the idea of a long struggle, since the prospect of sending tanks into such a large city as Moscow without heavy infantry support seemed risky after the costly capture of Warsaw in 1939. By November, the ground had frozen over, which solved the problems of mud for the armor. The Wehrmacht spearheads, consisting of 51 divisions, could now advance with the goal of encircling Moscow and linking up near Noginsk, east of the capital. The German 3rd and 4th Panzer Groups needed to concentrate their forces between the Volga Reservoir and Mosyansk, and then proceed the Soviet 3rd Army to Kiln and Snogorsk to encircle the capital from the north. Reportedly, Stalin asked Marshal Zhukov whether Moscow could be successfully defended and ordered him to speak honestly like a communist. Zhukov replied that was possible, but that reserves were urgently needed. German officers were able to make out some of the major buildings of the Soviet capital through their field glasses after capturing Kryanskaya Polyana, north of Moscow, about by 22 miles. Both Soviet and German forces were severely depleted, sometimes having only 150 riflemen, which was the company's full strength, to be left in a regiment. Because of the resistance on the northern and southern sides of Moscow, the Wehrmacht attempted a direct offensive from the west along the Minsk-Moscow highway near the city of Naro-Fominsk. This offensive had limited tank support and was directed against extensive Soviet defenses. After determined resistance from the Soviet 1st Guards Motorized Rifle Division and flank counterattack staged by the 33rd Army, the German offensive stalled and was driven back 4 days later in the ensuing Soviet counteroffensive. The European winter of 1941 and 42 was the coldest of the 20th century. On the 30th November, von Bock reported to Berlin that the temperature was 45 degrees Celsius, or negative 49 degrees Fahrenheit, which General Erhard von Rauss, commander of the 6th Panzer Division, kept track of in his war diary. These numbers indicated severely cold conditions, and German troops were freezing with no winter clothing, using equipment that was not designed for such low temperatures. More than 130,000 cases of frostbite were reported amongst German soldiers. The Axis offensive on Moscow had stopped, and Heinz Guderian wrote in his journal that the offensive on Moscow failed. We underestimated the enemy's strength, as well as his size and climate. Fortunately, I stopped my troops on the 3rd of December, otherwise the catastrophe would have been unavoidable. On the 5th of December 1941, the counteroffensive for removing the immediate threat to Moscow started on the Kalinin front. The southwestern front and western fronts began their offensives the next day. On the 8th of December, Hitler had signed his directive, number 39, ordering the Wehrmacht to assume a defensive stand along the eastern front. German troops were unable to organize a solid defense at their present locations and were forced to pull back to consolidate their lines. Guderian wrote that discussions with Hans Schmidt and Wolfram Führer von Richthofen took place the same day. Both commanders agreed that the current front line could not be held. On December 14th, Franz Halder and Gunther von Kluge finally gave permission for a limited withdrawal to the west of the Oka River, without Hitler's approval. On the 20th of December, during a meeting with German senior officers, Hitler cancelled the withdrawal and ordered his soldiers to defend every patch of ground, digging trenches with howitzer cells if needed. Guderian protested, pointed out that losses from the cold were actually greater than by combat, and winter equipment was held by traffic ties in Poland. Nevertheless, Hitler insisted on defending the existing lines, and Guderian was dismissed on December 25th, along with Generals Hoppener and Straussli. Walther von Braunst, Hitler's commander-in-chief, had been removed even earlier on the 19th of December. The Red Army's winter counteroffensive drove the Wehrmacht from Moscow, but the city was still considered to be threatened, with the front line still relatively close. Because of this, the Moscow theater remained a priority for Stalin, but first appeared to be in shock due to initial German success. However, immediately after the Moscow counteroffensive, a series of Soviet attacks, known as the Battles of Vyaziev, were attempted against the salient, each time with heavy losses on both sides, but eventually resulting in a Soviet victory. These victories allowed the Soviets to push back against the Germans in the north, leading to further victories for the Russians and more losses for the Germans, which continued to mount, beginning to get closer and closer towards the millions. While the Soviets had lost countless men, their production front continued to increase exponentially, with much of the Russian industry being turned exactly towards war. The production of new tanks such as the T-34 would soon shape the war and begin to change its course, while the Germans also continued their innovations. It was at this time that Stalin began pressuring the Allies for aid in the West, and to open up a second theater to draw the Germans away. However, Winston Churchill, concerned with growing Soviet power and wished to maintain what control the British had left over Europe, did not approve of this plan, also wishing to increase British air power over the British Isles in order to stop German aerial raids. Meanwhile, in America, the shift was focused more on defeating the Italians and Germans in North Africa. Aside from the American Lend-Lease, the Russians had no help to be gotten from the Western Allies, save the American material that was being pumped in across the Bering Strait. It seemed Russia was still to face the fascist Hydra alone. But for how long is the question? By spring 1942, despite the failure of Operation Barbarossa to defeat the Soviet Union, the Wehrmacht had captured vast expanse of territory, including Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic republics. Elsewhere, the war had been progressing well, such as the U-boat offenses in the Atlantic, and Erwin Rommel had just captured Torbuk in the east. Leningrad was stabilized, but still under siege. The initial objectives for the Germans in the region around Stalingrad were the destruction of industrial capacity and to take the Volga River. This would be key to capturing the Caucasus and the oil fields head in Baikal. On July 1942, Hitler personally rewrote the operational objectives for the 1942 campaign, including the city of Stalingrad. Both sides attached great value upon the city that bore Stalin's name, as Stalin would not be too happy if Hitler decided to take his city with his name on it, because that wouldn't be too good. As such, Stalin refused to allow civilians to evacuate, demanding that all who can shoot, and all that can work. The city was heavily defended, but was bombarded heavily by German Stukas and artillery. When the Germans occupied the city, around 40,000 were moved to Germany as slave workers, while some managed to escape the city during the battle, and only a few were evacuated. In February 1943, only between 10,000 to 60,000 civilians were still alive in Stalingrad. Much of the city was quickly turned to rubble, although some factories continued production while working, such as the Stalingrad tractor factory, which continued to turn out T-34 tanks until German troops entered the factory. Stalin brought all available troops to the east bank of the Volga, and some came from as far away as Siberia. Regular troop transports were destroyed by the German Luftwaffe and were replaced with civilian ferries and other small craft in order to transport troops across the river. Civilians, including workmen and children, were put to work building trenches and fortifications. However, the Soviets were eventually pushed back to the very edges of the Volga River, leaving the only way of supply to the city from across the bank of the Volga. The destruction of the city was so immense that the Soviet oil reserves in the southern and northern parts of the city along the bank of the Volga and were lit on fire, leading to the entire river being lit ablaze with oil and death. However, Stalin would not allow traitors or cowards to be tolerated, and he dispatched commissar squads under the order number 227, stating not one step back. So officers were dispatched and forced to execute any soldier that attempted to flee from the battle. This decreased morale, however, increased courage amongst the Soviet troops, as they would rather charge forwards and die at the enemy guns than at the hands of their own countrymen. This once again can be compared to the fighting style of the Japanese in the Pacific Theater. However, this was motivated less by devotion to the emperor, which, well, the Soviets didn't have an emperor, but more to the cause of the Soviet Union and to the wish for self-preservation. There was also the wish to protect their families and friends from the Germans as well, which also led to the increased defense of the Soviets, as they knew that death or failure would result in the deaths of millions more of their countrymen. It was in Stalingrad as well that some of the most brutal German killings of civilians occurred, as many civilians would be captured and tortured and then executed in front of Soviet defended places by the Germans in order to intimidate and demoralize them. This, however, only further to strengthen the resolve of the Soviets, who fought with a much further ferocity. In the city itself, the combat was extremely violent and brutal and can be compared to that was seen on the Pacific Front. Civilians were often caught in the crossfire, as fighting in the city often fought from house to house, street corner to street corner. It was often almost resolved in close quarters, with shovels, knives, bayonets, even bludgeoning people to death with the butts of the guns. The battle turned in the Soviets' favor under the counteroffensive codenamed Operation Uranus, which was stretched from November 19th through the 23rd, which had been planned by Zhukov. It was launched 2 spearheads some 50 miles north and south of the Germans, whose tip was at Stalingrad. The counter-offensive utterly surprised the Germans, who thought the Soviets of incapable of mounting such an attack. The operation was a deep penetration maneuver, attacking not the main German force at the forefront of the battle, but instead hitting the weaker flanks. Those flanks were vulnerably exposed on the open steppes surrounding the city and were weakly defended and undermanned. The attacks quickly penetrated deep into the flanks, and by November 23rd, the 2 prongs of the attack had linked up at Kalach, about 60 miles west of Stalingrad. The encirclement of the 2 German armies in Stalingrad was complete, and the German High Command urged Hitler to allow Paulus and his forces to break out of the encirclement and rejoin the main German forces outside the city and the encirclement. Hitler would not accept this and ordered von Paulus to stand and fight. With winter setting in and food and medical supplies dwindling, Paulus's forces grew weaker. In mid-December, Hitler ordered one of the most talented German field marshals, Erich von Manstein, to perform a special army corps to rescue Paulus's forces. This failed, along with Operation Saturn, which was the German name, and Soviet operations closed in as part of Operation Ring in January 1943. The situation was hopeless. The Germans were completely surrounded and annihilated, leaving the Soviets victorious on the Eastern Front. After this, the Soviets would continue their push westward against the Germans, striking victory after victory. At the Battle of Kursk, the Soviets would secure the largest tank victory in a tank battle the world has ever seen to this day. More Soviet and German tanks clashed on the field than would be seen up until and through the modern day. At Leningrad, the city was under siege since Operation Barbarossa began in 1941 and was liberated in 1943. More people died in both Stalingrad and Leningrad than Americans and British died on every front totaled. The Eastern Front was truly the most devastating front in the European conflict, although the Americans and British had finally arrived and began to fight the Germans in the West. After a victory by George Patton at El Alamein, the Americans quickly moved in and began to attack the Axis powers, starting by landing in Sicily. April 20th, 1945, on Hitler's 56th birthday, Soviet artillery of the 1st Belarusian Front began shelling Berlin and did not stop until the city surrendered. The weight of the ordnance delivered by Soviet artillery during the battle was greater than the total tonnage dropped by the Western Allies. On April 22nd, at his afternoon situation conference, Hitler fell into a tearful rage, famously dramatized in the film Downfall.
Das war ein Befehl! Der Angriff Steiners war ein Befehl!
When he realized that his plans, prepared the previous day, could not be achieved, he declared that the war was lost, blaming the generals for the defeat and that he would remain in Berlin until the end, before he killed himself. In an attempt to coax Hitler out of his anger, Alfred Jodl, a general, speculated that Walter Wenick's 12th Army, which was then facing the Americans, could move to Berlin because the Americans, already on the Elbe River, were unlikely to move further east. This assumption was based on his viewing of the captured Eclipse documents, which showed the division of Germany amongst the Allies. Hitler immediately grasped the idea, and within hours, Wenick was ordered to disengage from the Americans and move the 12th Army northeast to support Berlin. It was then realized that, if the 11th Army moved west, it could link up with the 12th Army. In the evening, Heinrich was given permission to make the link-up. On the 30th of April, the Soviets launched an attack on the Reichstag, but because of German entrenchments and support from German artillery, it was not until the evening that the Soviets were able to enter the building. The Reichstag had not been in use since it had burned in February 1933, leaving the building in ruin and disrepair. This favored the German defenders, as they used the rubble to entrench and defend themselves. Fierce room-to-room fighting, reminiscent of Stalingrad, ensued. But on May 2nd, 1945, the Red Army took control of the building entirely. The famous photo of the two soldiers planting the flag on the roof of the building is a reenactment photo taken the day after the building was taken. To the Soviets, the event is represented by the photo, and the photo became symbolic of their victory, demonstrating that the Battle of Berlin, as well as the Eastern Front hostilities as a whole, ended with the victory. Commander Zhichenko of the 756th Regiment stated in his order to his battalion commander, "The Supreme High Command and the entire Soviet people order you to erect the victory banner on the roof above Berlin." On the night of the 2nd of May, most of the remnants of the Berlin garrison attempted to break out of the city center in 3 different directions. Only those that went west through the Tiergarten and crossed over the Havel into Spandau succeeded in breaching Soviet lines. Only a handful of those who survived the initial breakout made it to the lines of the Western Allies. Most were either killed or captured by the Red Army. Early in the morning of May 2nd, the Soviets captured the Reich Chancellery, where General Wilding surrendered with his staff at 6 a.m. He was taken to see General Vasily Chuikov, where Wilding ordered the city's defenders to surrender to the Soviets. Berlin had officially fallen, and not long after, Germany surrendered under Kriegsmarine Admiral Karl Donitz. Many Germans attempted to flee west to the American and British lines to escape Soviet reprisals. The war in Europe was won. This closed the chapter on the Soviets' war in Europe, and yet still the chapter of America's war in the Pacific continued on.
Берлин побежден.